Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Diaz. I'm the Susan Brotman Deputy Director for Art here at the Seattle Art Museum. And thank you for joining us on this special day. The Seattle Art Museum wants to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land, the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. We honor our ongoing connections to these communities, past, present, and future. Today's talk is part of a series featuring scholars, artists, and thinkers inspired by the exhibition Following Space, Thaddeus Mosley and Alexander Calder, and part of our ongoing Calder at SAM initiative. These programs are designed to bring people into dialogue with the life and work of the renowned artist Alexander Calder, as well as the contemporary artists that continue to be inspired by him. This could not be possible without our incredible gift of the Shirley Family Calder Collection and our partnership with the Calder Foundation. And also thank you to Jason Porter and his team for putting today's program together. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you there's what's on view in the museum and some of our various sites. Following Space, the exhibition that's inspired today's talk, is on view until June 1st, and it's located on our third floor. If you haven't seen it already, I encourage you to see it after Malcolm's presentation. This is also the final weekend for the retrospective Joyce J. Scott Walk a Mile in My Dreams on the 4th floor, so please check that out one last time before you leave today. Looking ahead, we are thrilled to announce I Rebel, the art and activism of Ai Weiwei is coming to SAM on March 12th. This exciting exhibition will be the largest ever US presentation of this globally renowned conceptual artist making a landmark moment for our exhibition, for our museum and Seattle. Shortly after, on March 19th, we will debut Ai's stunning Water Lilies painting made of thousands of Lego bricks, which will be on display at the Seattle Asian Art Museum. And later on May 17th, his iconic Circle of Animals Zodiac heads will open at the Olympic Sculpture Park. So that's going to be Ai Weiwei represented at all three of our sites. I also want to draw your attention to two other programs that we offer. The first, Saturday University. It's our monthly lecture series at the Asian Art Museum, featuring scholars from around the country discussing themes in Asian art and culture. The program takes place the second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. Lastly, the Asian Art Museum, through a wonderful partnership with the Asia Society, we have a talk and performance by the legendary Indian violinist Ganesh Rajagopalan on February 20th in the evening, and tickets are available online. And if you want more information on everything that's happening at SAM, you can also become a member if you're not a member already. Now on to today's presentation. Malcolm Peacock, originally from Raleigh, North Carolina, is an artist and athlete whose art often utilizes and alternates everyday actions, such as talking, gazing, braiding, singing, running, to emphasize the stakes and feelings that accompany being present in proximity to others and oneself. His art looks closely at how intimacy creates emotional spaces occupied by Black folks. Last November, I read this morning, this interview, he was featured in Cultured Magazine's highly acclaimed annual list of the most outstanding young artists to know, and so you'll know him today. Malcolm has participated in residencies at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the University of Pennsylvania, St. Roch Community Church, and Joan Mitchell Center, and the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. He has exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art PS1 and Artist Space in New York, Terrault Gallery in Baltimore, the ICA of the Virginia Commonwealth University, as well as Prospect Triennial in New Orleans, and the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, which is also the home of Thaddeus Mosley. Peacock is the recipient of the 58th Carnegie International Fine Prize and the Foundation of Contemporary Art Roy Lichtenstein Award. After Malcolm's talk, we welcome you to offer your questions. We'll have this same microphone if you want to ask any questions to the artist. We are recording today's talk, so please use the microphone if you have questions. And without further ado, please give a round of applause for today's speaker, Malcolm Peacock.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear okay? All right, awesome. We did a sound check earlier, but you kind of have to do a second one. Thanks so much for the warm introduction. I'm gonna read hopefully be like not super monotone or not engaging. So, but I am gonna read from a paper because I kind of like need to get it all in. There will be some breaks in the cadence of the talk, so I just ask that you kind of bring all of yourself to it and yeah, maybe try to stay here and stay with me. But thank you guys so much for being here. I'm very happy and thankful to be here in your museum today. I have some long-standing friends that work with the museum, and so it's nice to be here with like old colleagues and old friends. Special thanks to Carson McCulley, Jason Porter, and Jose Diaz for coordinating this program today. A big thanks to Katarina Manchada, the John and Mary Shirley Curator of Contemporary Art here at your museum, and the Shirley family for the generous support of the Seattle Art Museum and care for the works of Calders that have more recently been gifted to the institution. A very big thanks to the Calder Foundation as well for making it possible for myself and others to continue to have access to his work long beyond the span of his life. Today I'm going to speak a bit about the artistic practices of Mosley and Calder and myself. And while the exhibition is one container for information about the artists, I also hope that today there are some moments of excitement and intrigue that arise for you from this form of sharing. So again, thank you for being here. I want to start in pointing out that both Calder and Mosley were brought up around some forms of art, but that a significant difference in their early lives are the ways in which their childhoods unfolded. Calder's parents were artists, while Mosley's father worked in coal mines. And there were days in which he witnessed him emerging from mines and thought that the life that he wanted for himself later would be one of great difference from his father's. I bring this biographical information up not to compare the two in a manner that is qualitative, but rather to draw out a frame of a larger historical context for the exhibition. One where we, as the public, consider the ways that history has come to be presented to us, who is a part of it, and how they are a part of it, and the ways in which we see ourselves as having roles in shaping its presentation for those that will live in the future. If one were to look at the majority of the spaces in which Thaddeus Mosley has been afforded to exhibit, they would not readily assume that by the year of 2025 that he and Calder would be showing side by side in a two-person exhibition at a major institution of this kind. So to me, it is historically remarkable, significant, that we all today, by choosing to be here, are playing some part in the telling of a story that is still very much being etched and carved into space and in reality. In preparation for today, I continue to come back to some type of current or wave, emotion or force, a line of some sort of wire or mark. Difficult to locate its start or its end, and perhaps it's better or more interesting to think of it as not possessing either. And what I kept circling around and being pulled back and propelled by was the necessity for change and adaptation that is so strongly embraced by both Thaddeus and Alexander Calder through the act of encounter. Whether standing, floating, soaring, reaching, or resting, Calder and Mosley present us with works that hold value across time. For me, that value is found in the spirit of invitation, to exchange, to look, to shift, to mine, to move around, to shape, to be shaped by, and ultimately an invitation to at once become present. Exploration and discovery sit at the core of these two makers' pursuits. So at 98 years old and based in Pittsburgh, Thaddeus is still very much at work in his studio on a regular basis. And much like his works, the cadence and the weight of objects in his studio have shifted to accommodate the changes that his body has undergone as a result of aging. Influenced deeply by traditions in African art, music, and literature, Mosley's art making is a ritual and learning materiality. I first encountered Thaddeus Mosley's work in person in 2021 at my hometown museum, the Baltimore Museum of Art. Organized by Jessica Bell Brown of the ICA at VCU, formerly from the BMA, Mosley presented an exhibition of 5 large-scale sculptures in the center of a rotunda in the museum. There is something special that happens when you encounter Mosley's sculptures in this manner, when you can walk around them. Although the sculptures that he creates are sometimes smaller than some of the trees that inhabit forests, They hold within them a particular sensibility that sometimes makes individuals want to crouch. Upon entering the rotunda, I noticed how abruptly the pace of my movement shifted. I was alone, slowly lurking around the periphery of the objects, but it felt more so that they were watching me as I restrained myself from climbing over the stanchions, eager to observe more of how they may have been made. It was the first time that I learned that Sam Gilliam's nickname for his friend Mosley was the Forest, a keeper of old trees, round trees, big trees, heavy trees. The nickname was beyond fitting for the moment, as I found myself a few rooms away from where I stood 18 years prior as a curious 9-year-old boy peering over a glass case that held a sculpture in the triple API section of the museum. And this is precisely one of Mosley's desires in making, to create works that can, in different ways, engage the senses and become a spiritual experience, ones full of discovery and realization and space for interpretation. While Mosley has gained much of his deserved acclaim in the last few years, it is not lost on me that the endurance of the practice, his commitment to craft, has far exceeded the need for recognition in the world of contemporary art. Richard Hunt described that a collector once saw Mosley's work and was convinced that he must have been using a machine for the detailed carvings that often leave traces of the artist's hand. His craftsmanship is indicative of his upbringing as a person who was raised amongst musicians. As an artist who works in process-based methods of repetition, I recognize the way that repetitive marks accumulate on the surface of these works, leaving them to feel touched in ways that are both resonant and earthly. Mosley himself affirms, "The ripple of chisel marks is important to me. You might say that they are related to my interest in jazz and dance. I use different widths and depths of gouge to make different marks, and shadows are the means by which one can appreciate the rhythms of chisel marks. The broad, deep gouges hold a depth of shadow. The narrow, shallow ones play along the surface of forms." Mosley serves as a counterpart, a partner, if you will, or a listener to the found logs and branches in his studio. Rather than imposing thematics upon them, he contends with who and what they are on an individual basis. And this allows for a great emphasis on weight and balance in space and time. Critic John Yao echoes, while almost every critic about Mosley has noticed the importance of the sculptures made by Brancusi and Noguchi, as he himself, I think it is more useful to recognize how far Thaddeus Mosley has actually traveled away from Brancusi and Noguchi, beginning with the individuality of each work, every artwork assembled from discrete, highly worked forms that have been fit together has its own individual personality. Alexander Calder, known widely for the creation of the mobile and fine art, was also no stranger to the terms of individuality. He was an artist who listened and absorbed significantly from changing environments. And in the early 1930s, a large shift took place in his life and practice after an influential visit to Piet Mondrian's studio in Paris. There, Alexander experienced, I would say, inside of himself, a vision or a projection of possibility, a different way of feeling in space, a potentiality that the space itself had already held, one that was being contained by the distinctions or separations of the walls and planes inside of Mondrian's studio. It was an extremely exciting room. Light came in from the left and from the right, and on the solid wall between the windows, there were experimental stunts with colored rectangles of cardboard. Even the Victrola, which had been some muddy color, was painted. I suggested to Mondrian that perhaps it would be fun for the rectangles to oscillate, and he, with a very serious countenance, said, "No, it is absolutely not necessary. My painting is already very fast." And this one visit gave me a shock that changed things. Though I had heard the word modern before, I did not consciously know or feel the term of abstraction. So now, at 32, I wanted to paint and work in the abstract. And for 2 weeks or so, I painted very modest abstractions. In the fall of 31, Marcel Duchamp had visited Calder's studio, and he shared with Duchamp what would end up being termed a mobile. However, the mobile had a motor, and that drove the motion and the movement of the sculpture's physical parts. Motors would later be extracted from the pieces as natural elements, such as light, air, and human interaction would be moved to the fore, and these become the driving forces that we know today for the works that have sustained in most of the large public image of Alexander Calder. Calder recalls the visit with Duchamp. There was motor-driven thing with 3 elements. The thing that had just been painted was not quite dry yet. Marcel said, "Do you mind?" When he puts his hands on it, the object seems to please him. He arranges for me to show in Marie Catali's gallery close to the Madeleine, and I asked him what sort of a name I could give these things. He at once produced mobile. So while the mobiles of Calder's may be the ones that come to mind for many of us in hearing the utterance of his name, the works of art that predate the mobiles are actually equally interesting for their contributions to the landscape of public interaction and performance in contemporary art. And from a young age, Calder's understanding of art as integral to the world in which it exists flourished by way of making toys and jewelry that became a large part of his family's life. Calder would document the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circuses as an illustrator for the Police Gazette on assignment. I was very fond of spatial relations. I loved the space of the circus. I made some drawings of nothing but the tent, the whole thing, the vast space. I've always loved it. So with these found materials, such as wire and leather, rubber and cork, Calder developed Sir Calder in 26. Sir Calder is an artwork that grows over the span of 5 years, drawing from the experience of witnessing the circus. These miniature figures and apparatuses that he stages are performed in acts for audiences domestically and abroad. A major aspect of the circus that he adopted and worked towards is executing the tradition of coordinated failures of tricks and moves followed by successes. It is a type of theatrical element, created environments and atmospheres where audiences would experience a range of emotional vantage points from anticipation to excitement and relief. We'll watch a video, I think, in this next slide of one of the performances. Drawings of the tents.
Sur les plaines, il y a des chevaux sauvages. want to thank. El hombre de 1000 chalecos.
Yeah, I think we're good. Okay. This also sounds sharper or maybe louder, but okay. Although differing visually, it's clear to see the ways in which the circus performances and mobiles both rely heavily on environment and elements of space in order for the works to be fully experienced and appreciated in totality. Today, the Whitney Museum of American Art holds in its collection all the contents that filled this 5 suitcases of the circus. These suitcases made it possible for the work to be traveled compactly and to be shared widely across the world. In 2016, when I finished my undergraduate studies, I met a group of arts and cultural workers in Baltimore, Maryland, running a nomadic museum called The Contemporary. While the museum no longer exists, one of their lasting principles that stuck with me, and I believe Mosley and Calder would agree in its validity, is that audience is everywhere. So in moving to discuss more of my own practice, I want to begin by introducing my work from the Prospect Triennial in New Orleans, Louisiana. For the exhibition, over the course of 4 months, I traveled the city of New Orleans, where I lived at the time, serving red beans and rice to friends, colleagues, and strangers, all individually, one at a time, and all in spaces of their own, be those homes, hotels, Airbnbs. I would meet anyone, anywhere, whomever had signed up in the city and performed the work. Rooted in my experience as an employee in the city in the food service industry, I was interested in critiquing the history of Southern hospitality that had so quickly and pervasively became a part of my everyday life. Its abusive and subservient conditions that it made possible and it must be occupied by groups of people to uphold the tradition's success as a tool for the production and accumulation of capital in the city of New Orleans. Hosty, the root of the word hospitality, its original etymological origin, actually means other, outsider, foreigner, danger, quite the opposite of the contemporary understanding and connotation of the word hospitality that is in use today. Like Calder's circus, these performance works that I made could only exist in their original state, and even in their restaging or their repetition, each performative iteration was special, different, and individual in its own, living on only through the lives, thoughts, and words of the individuals that experienced them. So while there are no photos of the 100-some performances from New Orleans in 2021 and 2022, a written account serves as its documentation. He remained silent and still had yet to speak. The bowl was placed on the table, and he had sat so close to me in this otherwise spacious room. I think there was an opportunity to say no, but I was in. As the audio played, he began to feed me. This was the time where the most of so many of the images and thoughts that I had began to race through my mind. The history of white folks being served by Black people in this country, the variation of this experience in time and place, and by age of the participants in this moment. I thought of Ernestine, an older Black woman that we had hired when my middle daughter was born with an undetected craniofacial deformity. Ernestine and I would stay up all night feeding my daughter with an eyedropper, and that turned into a long and positive relationship. I thought of the first time that this life or death relationship between my daughter and this older Black woman, in a large part, is probably why my daughter ended up becoming a young scholar on otherness. I thought of white New Orleanians that I know, that I look like, that I've met, who don't like Black folks, but almost name their daughters after their own Black nannies from their childhood. I thought of the trope of the field slave and the house slave, the audio of Malcolm moving quickly through space, that one being the one in the field, and Malcolm, the silent feeder, inside my home now, still without agency, serving me, while we both remain silent, exposed to historical, contemporary horrors. I thought of the disgust of the cost of service. I thought of my Irish heritage and the brutal destruction the English imposed, how my fire for justice at the level that I can understand, at least in this country, comes from a time when the Irish were not white. And I'm nearly repulsed at where I am, where this artist has placed me. And yet all of these have flashed into my brain as clear as day within only a minute. The trust, how did I know to trust Malcolm? Is that the power of an artist, a good one? I had not thought of this relationship before. I am a cynical optimist, and if an artist can trick me, I think I appreciate that. But Malcolm, I trusted him as soon as we sat down, and he had created this world and I became available. But as we spoke later, his reaction was also a variable. I gave as much as I could to stay in the space. It was hard, and both the text and the sounds of persistent running solidified the emotional and intellectual aspects of the history. But throughout our time, I trusted him, and I trusted him to let us fall. And it was where and how and why I broke so deeply into this creation. Trust between an artist and the consumer or the participant. I committed as much as I could. A statement from Brad Powers written in 2022 in reflection of we served and they felt, a tiny burst along the horizons. So as I begin to work further and further into this fascination with the power of myth and direct contact, I traveled to the ICA at VCU in 2021 to present a work as part of Doing Language, a project that was organized to think through different ways that language circulates and helps to give weight to the fleeting moments of our lives. I wrote and memorized a script, a brief 5-minute monologue, and hired my friend Dennis to do the same. We roamed through the event space of a book launch that evening, engaging separately with individuals in close eye contact, attempting to behave as seamlessly and as normally as possible before uttering the text. An account reads as follows. Milling at an art opening, I anxiously tame my mind in a way that guards with a smile. As I fade in and out of the conversation, emerging from a circle of friendly professionals, my body begins to hover near a table lined with books, the same publications that we are celebrating here that evening, the brightly bound structures that brought me. A young Black male presenting person, I later glean from mutual friends and the performance that he prefers he is next to me. He asks me if we have met before. I wonder aloud. We begin to look into each other's eyes, hesitantly at first, searchingly at last. We give brief reports on how we may have come into previous contact. He's very gentle, sways beside me, slightly laughing. I'm prodding my horrible memory, thinking nervous through colleagues, lovers, students, artists. We laugh softly as he catches my eye. I notice he's no longer speaking about our potential shared memory. He's now speaking of his own memories, a story of two lovers. Something very painful is beginning to happen, something hard to put into words at any time. His language laces with poetics. He holds my eyes steady. I am immersed in the odd state of observing and being demanded upon, something I feel only when confronted with art or the contradictions that hold me from understanding what is going on. I watch and listen and silently cheer for what I now recognize as a performance, one that my dear friend has dreamt into life. I hold the space between myself and this person, holding the space of art and performance, but mostly holding the space of uncertainty of the story. This person, who I may or may not have known, quietly delivers precision in text and tension, marking our time together. When I try to recall the words, I am brought to discomfort, made by racial tensions around me, present in the country, a kind particular to my experience in Richmond, Virginia, teaching at a major art institution, wrought with inequity of every kind as a white, queer, cis woman. My awareness folds and unfolds between the way that he portrays anger, anguish, and romance. Attraction may have been one of the ways in which we encountered each other, a soft flirting, or a performed recognition. Something was extremely charged. The romance, however, is not between us, although the parallel observation I note brought me to engage on so many levels. The romance that he spoke of was between two black men with so much longing in his voice. As a romance writer, I don't take such intimacies lightly. I felt love in voice, and by extension, in place. At a point or comma, somehow a friend came to ask if I wanted to leave, and they weren't certain that they wanted reassurance. I tried not to break the space, the eye contact between myself and the performer. I didn't want to interrupt, and so I didn't, and I ignored her at first. And then I smiled quietly, telling them that everything was fine. Everything was fine. The words coming out of my mouth felt more alien than the strange new space between me and this young man. Nothing around me was fine, and I again appreciated this space, overdetermined, entirely improvised, that allowed for a listening of these force fields at play all around us, all of the time. The fields and forces with so many names and academia that cannot hold the violence or the movement possible between two particular strangers of varying identities in history at an art opening in celebration of reading in Richmond, Virginia. When Dennis had finished, our eyes lightly darted and rested to the side once again. We both giggled nervously, and I thanked him for sharing, for the performance, for the space that he had made with me, and here and now with Malcolm too. We spoke of our names, allowing an invitation, and then we parted somewhat abruptly. I stared blankly into the fluttering social scene before me, and I felt that finally something had happened. I learned to read differently that day. The next day, I wrote to Malcolm that I experienced the thing that I try to do in my artwork often and almost never achieve, the kind of intersubjective affect, the way to feel and think, engaging while longing, to hold an actual space between people that highlights the importance of discomfort, rage, and pain, and at the very forefront of an encounter that humanizes while alienates, an encounter that is highly romantic in its ability to both attract and other, center and decenter, some form of self that one can try to name, but in the end, only an encounter can act, grow, and change. For this reason, I will read this text aloud and hope that some of his work falls through the things that I cannot begin to articulate on the page. Cara Benedetto. As a student in Richmond, Virginia, I had become interested in a rebellion of enslaved folks that had taken place in Richmond in 1800. For doing language, I wanted to make something that thought about or used this sort of format of whisper, rumor, or conspiracy. In historical literature and legality, rebellions led by enslaved folks are deemed as conspiracies. Conspiracy in its origin of etymology actually means to breathe together, with, inspire, being related to breath and spirit. The circulation and one-on-one sharing in the middle of the crowd was a way to speculate about what it may have been like to attempt to galvanize support around an idea that some supported and some didn't, but ideas that ultimately felt pressing, urgent, and emancipatory at that time in history. I'm thinking today about the word conspiracy, its contemporary connotations, and what place it may hold in helping us to determine the stakes of our individual voices in a rapidly changing political landscape. The next few images before some visual work of mine are figurines and apparatuses that were part of the suitcases from Calder Circus. I think this may be some of the ones that we saw from the video. Okay, so the last two works that I'm going to talk about today of mine are sort of these like sculptures or installations that are almost a cross between my visual work and what is like an attempt to bring performance into physicality in a space where I no longer have to be present, like in an insistent, everyday way, like I have done in the past for the other works that I had given accounts about. So this work is completed in Portland, Oregon, as part of the 2023 Converge Biennial, a show that brings together some local artists from the city of Portland and then artists from outside of the city as well. So I lived in Portland for the summer of 2022 and the summer of 2023. And in the first summer, I was sort of just trying to have an experience and was housed there, kind of in residence, but also kind of like not doing anything, taking these really long walks, just trying to meet people and figure out what it was about this city, if anything, that caught my attention. The sort of general, like, I think consensus about the Pacific Northwest is that it's strikingly beautiful, and its landscape is almost like unspeakable and deeply awe-inspiring. And then one of the other things that really jumped out to me that I knew about coming to the city, but that I was really, for lack of better words, like curious or interested in, was its racial dynamics and like where folks that looked like me didn't show up or weren't present so much visually, but where the city of Portland operated on a political level in a really specific way due to that absence. So it was the first time that I really traveled somewhere where I didn't experience, was very confused about where like law enforcement played a role in the city. And what I really came to understand was that there wasn't so much of that presence due in part to the demographic makeup of the place. But what that also did was it made it really, really, like, I mean, I'm really intrigued by the almost danger of going to a location where you may not, where there's no one around or no one looks a single kind of way like you at all, because what was very intriguing was the way in which the landscape could then be occupied. It was that there was a way in which that invisibility created like a sense of sovereignty or like power that I had access to that normally wouldn't have in any other location. So in the second summer when I went back, I had to work and like really make some art, which I did not do the first the first time around. And this was the work that I ended up making for the Converge Biennial, which is about like maybe a 19 to 20 inch tall, not very tall, kind of like braided stump or bed that individuals could sign up to come to this gallery, which if you're ever in Portland, it's called S.E. Cooper Gallery. It's a little out there, but excellent space, ran by Derek Franklin, that sits on his land behind his family's home. And upon sign up, an individual one at a time would have access to an audio file that's embedded into this pillow, which is a performative monologue that I make while running through Eugene, Oregon. So I grew up as the child of a hairstylist, and I've been braiding like for fun, kind of for most of my life, with like random, literally any object or anything that like simulates or feels like hair. And about 10 years ago, I started to incorporate that material into my work, which is like less of a material engagement or material interest in like synthetic hair. It, of course, yes, it has a deep cultural relevance in Black history, but it was more so the act of endurance of making this large spanning surface that took the entirety of the summer to complete. And I've always seen the process of braiding as one that is deeply embedded in commitments between two or more people, and is really invested in like the sacrifice of time that that one person is willing to give over to another person, and what that says about like what that says about Black communion in throughout time. So these works are made from graphs in large part of sort of like really doing these, there's a lot of math that's involved to get the circle sort of complete, but also for the gradations and transitions from different colors and shades and variations of light and tones. Okay, so this is a separate work. I'm gonna show this work sort of like as if you were in the gallery, like looking up on it really closely, and then to sort of like shifting and moving back. So these are close-ups of a larger work, and this work is housed right now at MoMA PS1 in Long Island City, part of an exhibition that is a partnership between the Studio Museum in Harlem and MoMA PS1. When I started the residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem, I was really like fiddling around in the studio every day trying to come up with what I was going to make for the show, which was not for about another year. I tend to work in like long spans of time and am very slow kind of in my thinking. And so I was sort of trying to get a little bit ahead of the 8 ball on what I would make, and nothing was really coming to mind until a walk one day, and I like looked up at a tree and thought about Portland and like thought about Seattle, and every little thing came rushing through, and I just became very, very committed and locked into the idea that I would be braiding this tree. So for the last year, I made this work, and right now you're sort of like, maybe we're kind of like walking around it in a way. And these photos are sort of taken almost kind of from maybe the bottom or near the bottom of the sculpture. So these braids were made from February of last year until October or September of last year. And the work itself is assembled through a fabricated form of like 8 parts, because the sculpture is 8 feet tall and 8 feet wide and can't really be moved into a building. So the 8 parts are modular and collapse through a locking system where an individual climbs up a ladder on the outside of the sculpture and then climbs down into the inside and unbolts it in its respective pieces. So the work, this tree, coming to the idea, like I think, and a lot of times in my practice, and I think a lot of artists work in this way, you come to ideas, and something I remember, I think, hearing when I was younger is like, your first idea is never your best idea, which I don't agree with, but a lot of times it's true. I just don't think it's like a great overarching statement, but yeah, like sometimes your first instinct is your best one. And I think my first instinct for it was my best idea at the time, but I was also like, well, it's not, for me, enough for it to be like, oh, I'm making a tree. Like, we need to be able to like explain, or like think and feel through like why a tree and why now and what this, what is this symbolic for? What are you thinking through? And as I started to do more research on like what tree or what I was trying to really convey through tree, I was learning a lot about a tree that only grows in the Pacific Northwest, the coastal redwoods, which to me it's just nature's, it's a beast of an organism, but it is like, I think it speaks so much to things about like mutuality and communal gathering that I am often trying to communicate through the braiding practice. So it was just like a sort of match made in heaven. I felt really lucky to come to the idea like in November. And the redwood is a tree that can regenerate itself on its own, and its family grows in a perfect Like when one dies, it often produces offspring that grow in a perfect circle, sort of like in a shape that hugs it, or that's right around it, because its roots, although the tree would like shoot through the ceiling of this building and its height, its roots are like only double, at most, like double most of our heights of the people in this room. So it doesn't have like deep, it's very shallow roots, but it can withstand things that happen in the air at an extreme height because of how strong and how widespread and how connected its lineage continues for. So some of the goal in the work was to create an object that felt like it was really hard to locate where its start and its end were, and that was really hard to sort of determine like how it was made, the same way that when we sort of look at things that fascinate us in nature, we have it's possible to have feelings of like wonder of how something was constructed or why it moves us in a particular way. Alongside, I think there might be one more image or two. Okay, so like alongside of that looks completely different. I'm like, what is this? Whose work is this? But this is like the PS1. It's a good question. Someone had asked me like, what do you consider the front? Like, what's the front of the work? And I was like, I don't know, but like whatever the best side is. But there's a scrim, which I think there's an image of two folks. Yes. So this is like what I would call the front of the work, only because that is where it was sitting when you first walked into my studio where I made it. This is the first area that you would see. And this sort of sheet right here that we saw before the two folks was that covered it is to like simulate or to allude to the fog of the Northwest, where that's like the richest place for those trees to grow and really like prosper, because they do well in moisture. So the work's other component, when I spoke of like wanting to combine in that first work from Portland, the elements of like sound, performance, and sculpture, whereas in that work the audio sits inside of a speaker that is in a pillow that's horribly, very immaturely like engineered to where you can almost kind of see the speaker. For this work, I was like, I wanted to really invest in, whether it was time or money or whatever, in trying to hide the audio source. I've been trying for like years to figure it out and never could get it right, and luckily was working with engineers who like know how to do things. So the audio for this work is in the walls, so you can't see it, but you can feel it because the speaker is kind of touching the drywall. There are six channel audio of the same audio, but 6 speakers that surround the sculpture, and the audios sort of are different moments of communion, a few different running monologues with me and teammates and friends and family, but they sort of speak about just different individuals' specific relationships to endurance, whether that is in sport, whether that's in a really recent struggle in their lives. And that work, for me, making it, came at the very end of the residency, right as the show was opening. It's just a really amazing thing to get to practice with other people, to put into an artwork, but also to make something that is sort of the jumping off point for new work. So that's sort of the direction where the work is headed at the moment, is kind of digging more into sculpture and sound together, and seeing where it takes the work and where that sits with other people and audiences in their lives. So yeah, that is, I think this is our last slide, last part, and yes, we can open up to questions. So thank you so much. I think that we have a, okay, awesome. mic that Jason will pass and, okay, awesome, thanks.
So thank you for that. That was an amazing talk.
Thank you.
I know that you spent a lot of time in nature when working on some of your most recent work, and that your practice and just you as a person is a lot about being immersed in nature. I wonder, kind of being more from the East Coast, how has your practice as an artist evolved, or has your connection to nature always been a part of how you discover and articulate your practice?
I found like I have this moleskin that I don't use anymore that I was using in 2017, and I found a bunch of notes that I was writing like that year on the outdoors, and everything was so, I was like researching a lot from this environmentalist named Carolyn Finney, writes a lot about Black folks in the outdoors, and that was when I started to think through this relationship that I've kind of always had to nature as a kid. I grew up in Baltimore, and in parts of the suburbs of Baltimore, I ran a lot with other children through woods, but it was a huge, cool thing to get to do as a kid, and to be unsupervised doing that, super dangerous, but really fun. But I never, like, that didn't click in my work, I think, until I left Richmond. And that was because, like, Richmond was so, like, it wore its history of the Confederacy and stuff. Like, the enslaved history was so palpable there. And so much of that was about the outdoors. Like, so much of their lives is on display through the African burial ground. And yeah, when I finished, I think around that time when I finished college, like 16, 17, it started to come more into like, okay, well, maybe this is a thing you want to think about in your work. But it wasn't until recently that I started to like kind of bridge that gap in between the ideas and the work. I think working more visually allowed me to do that. Like, working in performance, I could do that, but bringing that as a aspect for others to experience came more into the fore through the visual. Yeah.
I'm really interested in hearing about some of your thoughts and reflections. Hear your comparing your experience as an African-American artist with that of Thaddeus Mosley, Joyce Scott, so many of my generation and older, how different it is. Here, we're meeting you at age 30, just at the beginning of your career, and I had never heard of Thaddeus Mosley until his work came to this museum. And just how you, as you reflect on our elders and the different experience, the world welcoming and creating opportunities for you compared to them.
Yeah, I read something the other day. I've been doing a lot of, like, I wrote a while ago and then have just kept adding to this writing that I shared today about Thaddeus and Alexander. And one of the things that I read was a friend of Thaddeus, is someone who works in art, had asked him, or had said to him, like, hey, you know, like, if you were white, like, things would have happened differently for you. Like, things just, and like said it to him, it seemed like fairly recently. And I kind of read it and kind of giggled a little because I was like, I mean, okay, like, obviously, but also, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it's like, what can he do about that? Or like, what could he do, you know, now? And so I've been like, I think I've just been really thinking about like the landscape has changed in like it's undebatable. Like, landscape has changed dramatically. Like, we see way more Black artists showing in major institutions. We see like way younger Black artists showing in major institutions. And I also am like, when you bring up a really good point about opportunities, I also really recognized where it's actually not enough. Somebody that I really like learned this well from is Linda Good-Bryant and Thomas J. Lax. It's really actually not enough for us to think about just placing people of certain races and ethnicities in gaps. It's actually super important for us to like close gaps, but think about the historical nature of like why those holes even existed in the first place. It's like what I'm less interested in is just being placed in position of privilege and opportunity without there being like some closer analysis as to like why that gap was there and what we're collectively interested in doing inside of this field to create a history that's like truly reflective of who is making work in a historical time. But I mean, I have such Joyce is someone that I met Joyce when I was 22, and she was like, I was just like, oh, this is really what it looks like if you were to occupy a position of not questioning whether you deserve to be in a space. Someone who just really assumes, she just assumes the position of honor and respect, and is very gracious in paying that to other people as well. Yeah, I mean, having those markers has just been, it feels sometimes like too good to be true that you actually have some models, of like how to go through a thing. But I'm very grateful for those people, and I hope that like we consider that young Black artists consider that those people existed and still do, because it's not enough to reap benefits. Things like have to be a part of sharing. It has to be a part of collectivism, or or it's just not what it can be, if not.
I noticed that specifically about this piece, you mentioned a lot of your motivations were like that these huge trees of the Pacific Northwest were like almost alien and like completely like otherworldly, and like you wanted the viewer to be like, how is this thing even made? How is it put here? What were some like processes and like other like things that you learned that were like new to you in the creation of this piece?
I guess I'll have a question just briefly to your question. Like, do you have any? Are you just like, what are some things you learn in the process of making it, or in general, like whatever comes up, or are you like, what are things that you learn logistically, or things you learn formally, or I just want to be like precise when answering, and whatever you are interested in.
I guess just I don't know, like whichever one of those questions you prefer to answer.
Yeah. All right, you're like, just say something. I learned a lot. I was emailing the registrar. I learned. I mean, I knew what a registrar was, but I learned what a registrar was, like for real. And now I'm like, that's your actual person. Like when you're the artist, I'm like, that's the person. The curator, yes, of course, but no, the registrars are super important. And I was emailing the Studio Museum's registrar for this show. Left and moved to American Federation for the Arts, and I was emailing her yesterday because I just want to catch up and give her a proper thank you for the work on this project. But I learned like so much, and it's hard to, I'm like, oh man, I really learned like what happens when you exceed capacity. like when an artist pushes to exceed others' capacities. And I think I had done that before, but in performance, when you're like running around a city on your bike, there's a way in which you can just do whatever you want because no one knows what you're doing. And there's some joy that the artist gets from that, and there's some joy that the curator gets from that too, because it's like, this is like one less child that I have to, monitor and be like, what's going on? This is a really different thing because everyone sees, we all see this all the time. And so with this work, like, I learned where the lines or balance, like, how to sort of stretch out the desire around, like, just simply finishing. It seems like that would be an easy thing, but the act of like getting through the finish line of how to be both the maker and one of the project managers on an exhibition, like that was a huge thing for me to have to learn. I learned about fabrication processes that I had no clue about prior. All of these things that the registrar and the curator were very like sharp with me on, like, Malcolm, like, do you want to do this? Do you think this fabricator is the right fabricator? It doesn't matter if you work with them one time because it could be somebody that you end up wanting to work with. This is a really important decision that you might be making for the rest of your life. Like, do you want to work with this person again? Yeah, and I think to speak about the piece, like the art making part, like really in the technical nitty-gritties, is I think one of the biggest things I learned is that, like, my work is, like, I think my work is harder than sometimes I understand until I start, and it's really hard to balance the desire for wanting to finish something with the desire for how you want it to be. And I really wanted it to be the way I wanted it to be, and I had never worked with an assistant before in a long-spanning way before this. And I did, and it was really hard because I needed something sometimes. Some weeks I was really pleased with what I received in response in the work, and then there were some weeks where I was like, this looks good, but it doesn't look like I want it to look. And everyone else, of course, believes, like, well, no one's gonna notice that except you. But you notice it, and that matters. It really does, because once it's done, it's done. You get another chance, of course, always, like when you make the next work, but for that time it is done. And that was, I mean, it's not something that's like, I don't think it's something, and Thaddeus has said this often, it's not something that like you master, or like, I don't think there's anything you really like, oh, I could figure that out. But it's a push and pull, like, through time of like, okay, maybe this thing is okay to have someone for, or like this thing, but some things are like, nah, we just have to like understand that this one's just gonna be you, and it's gonna take longer, and it'll just be what it is. I can hear you if you want. I mean, Jason is making his way.
Just riffing off of that last question, I'm really curious about your process. First of all, I want to say I really appreciated how you answered the second question you were.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was beautiful. But what is your process? Do you do a maquette? Do you sketch? How did you arrive at this beautiful work?
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't really do it. I usually sit, I'm gonna be like very like straightforward how it works. I usually like am out on a run or something, or I'm like trying to sleep and I'm like thinking of like, what do I want, which is bad, and then I don't do much drawing or anything. I came up with the tree, and then I was like, okay, well, and I texted my friend, he works at Carnegie Gallery in New York. He's a preparator. And I was like, hey, I know this is so stupid, you're gonna kill me, but like, I wanna make this braided redwood, like, and I want it to be 8 feet tall and like 8 feet wide. And he was like, okay. So we started to source, like we were texting and emailing different shops in New York. And then we got quotes and everything was like a little too expensive. And then we landed on someone and I made a drawing. I didn't think about this, but I should have included them. But like, I made a drawing that kind of looks like this. No braids, just like the armature. And so what it looks like without any braids is like a gray, it's just like a big gray swirly thing. And then I made a drawing that, if you were to imagine this contour shape, I made a drawing of that on a piece of paper, like a circle, but with all these ridges in it. And then I made another one of the similar thing, but it was smaller, and that was inside of that big circle. The wider one would indicate the bottom, the smaller circle would indicate the top, so it's a bird's eye view. So there's that drawing, and then there's this profile view drawing, and I gave that to the builder, and then I don't know how many months went by before I heard anything, and then he sent me like a CAD and a Rhino, like all this, the 3D model stuff. And he was like, okay, well, that's actually not what happened. He came to my studio and he brought me a sample, like a slither of the tree, basically. And yeah, it was like, he walked in there, it was like 2 feet wide and 8 feet long. And then it had 3 dividers of different surfaces. And he was like, you need to glue braids to each of these surfaces so we can figure out which one we're gonna make the piece with. And then in June, he told me to come to the studio, and this existed. Like, and I was just like, that's it? Like, and it looked way too big and scary, and I was like, this is, like, I'm immediate flop. But yeah, 3D modeling, a lot of troubleshooting with the museum, because the day before we went to his studio to look at it, it wasn't fitting on Rhino, like it wasn't fitting into the room of the gallery, which was like scary, but we divided it into more pieces. So originally it was supposed to be 4 segments, and then we had to end up making it 8, which worked for everyone because they were then lighter. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Thank you.
I'm curious about, so you're talking about Mosley with the materiality in process and that relationship and partner and counterpart. And I'm wondering, maybe I missed something that was more complex, and something about Calder removing the motor. What would you describe Calder's kind of relationship with his art, if opposed to materiality? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, like, because it's a thing, I think because the relationship is a thing that's unseen. Like, I think, in the same way, that's why for this talk, I wanted to sort of spend a little more time talking about the circus, is that I think his big interest is, like, not yes, in found materials and goods as part of the work, but in things, in the forces that make it possible for those works to continue to move. And obviously those changes that we see in the gallery are not like as drastic as that first piece that had the motor in it, but they're discernible, especially in the large scale works that are like maybe more so like in outdoor, we see them at parks and stuff. Those elements of gravity, of light, of humidity, of wind play such a role. And so, I mean, yes, I think we could always classify that as materiality, but it's not the same as something that's, like a felt tactile one. And there's been, like, in history, like, people writing about Calder that, I mean, I think we might not like think this immediately, but the work is like kind of, I don't know if I would go to say to the extent to use the word controversial, but the work was really contested at the time because there wasn't moving sculpture before it, and some people really, really praised that work for its willingness to be open to play and to chance and to like things happening, or in the circus performances, like for open to the anticipation of something happen that they weren't expecting. But there were people that were really like super disinterested in his work because they didn't find it to be like scholarly or serious enough, because they did think that the elements that he was using were like invisible, or that the materiality like wasn't present.
Last question. One over here, Heather. Down here.
Actually, you can ask the question. I just want to make a comment. As an elder, I'm very proud of you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay?
Thanks.
Because what you're doing is what you want to do. I want to encourage you to keep creating to your spirit. And I'm not surprised we're looking at this spiritual expression, because you talked about the relationship to braids. And braiding goes all the way back to the continent of Africa. We've been braiding for centuries, but you said something very quickly that I don't want to miss. You said math. A lot of people are not aware that's a prime example of symmetry. And we were experimenting and creating math long before the Europeans came over to the continent. Just want to say thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to revisit your piece that is like the braided stump and bed.
You want to go back? You want me to flip back?
Oh, if you'd like to,
yeah,
please.
Sure.
Something I was reflecting on while you were sharing this piece was the earlier story you were telling about your experience at the evening about books. And this is both inviting and also a little alienating, right? Like if you're hearing someone running while they are like literally laying on your devotion of time here, and you're still working and running and reading to them, how both welcoming and othering that might feel. And I'm just really curious how you want to define that line with the consumers of your art. I think it's just so intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is how I want the line to be defined, is like, I want it to be, I think that like often I'm using like the feeling of, I work a lot from an emotion. I think a lot of people do, but I want the feeling that like I experience at 5 a.m. Like I always record the running monologues at roughly like 5 or 6 in the morning. They're always recorded at sunrise. And part of that is technical, because I can't have it be, I never can make them in New York City because there's too many people. So they always have to be in a sort of location that's not that populated. But the monologue for this is made in Arcadia Park. Not Arcadia, I'm sorry. Is that the name of the park? Maybe it is. So it's in Eugene, Priest-Trail. Well, anyway, but maybe it's Arcadia. I'll find out, let you know. That park ended up being really deserted, but there's a tension in being there, because although there is no one there, I just have like historical stuff on me, like anywhere that I go, and I think people that are deemed to be othered in whatever way often feel that, and that's like hard to shake, like regardless of what type of confidence you have or experience you have, like being in a space. It does not feel native, like even though I love that park, it doesn't feel native. And so something that some folks described when they came to the gallery, like you can see how close the piece is to the wall, like it's not a big space. And they were like, yeah, you know, one of the things is like, when you're looking at it, it's really hard to not touch it. And my work is like, fortunately, it's not super sensitive to like touch or you know, material. Like, it could, like, I don't want necessarily like, let's scratch it, but it could handle touch. And I'm really interested in that tension because I think that that tension is like indicative of what happens when we're in spaces or up in in the presence of something that is like really changing us, or it has the capacity to change us. I think very similar to like addressing, let's say, a trauma or something, like when faced or being like really close and personal with it, it's when it's like, it's its scariest, but it's also at that moment, it's holding its most potency, like its most potentiality. But it is a, you know, it comes up in the performative works too that I talked about, like when I walk into someone's house and I have on a mask and I'm there for hours and I just don't speak until like right before I leave. Like I'm doing that in a really, it's done in an extremely pointed way for a really particular reason, because I'm really interested in questioning like, okay, well, what is the definition of service? Or what is the definition of providing? You know, like what happens when we really like start to question these apparatuses that are established for us and how we interject in them. So thanks for your question. I really am, it's something that I'm like, sometimes I wrestle and sometimes I'm like, is this something, oh, this is really awkward. I'm like, oh, but then no one's wanna, and I'm like, it's finding that balance of like, where is it both intriguing and almost like, it's like almost thinking about food in a way. It's like, where is it like, oh, I kind of want to eat, or like, that, does that make sense when I say food? Like I'm thinking about something in the frame of like, what makes something enticing? And then thinking about, okay, but like, how do I also still establish that this is not necessarily anything to be possessed by just one person, but that this is like, this and the tree are things that ultimately there's not two. So like if you and I walk into this space, like we have to share this thing, whether we end up talking or not. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Malcolm.
Thanks,
and thanks everyone for being here. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And please visit the rest of the museum.